Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Art Markman. I'm a professor of psychology, human dimensions of organizations, and marketing at the University of Texas, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today and our moderator. First, the speaker. We are pleased to have Steve Ballmer here with us today. Steve is a former Microsoft CEO and founder of USAFacts, the most comprehensive and understandable source available for data about our nation. USAFacts.org provides a nonpartisan, nonprofit, and well-visualized look at data and trends in U.S. spending, revenue, and demographics, and policy outcomes aimed at helping Americans ground our debates in facts. Along with his wife, Connie, Steve serves as co-founder of Ballmer Group, which supports efforts to improve economic mobility for children and families in the United States who are disproportionately likely to remain in poverty. Steve is chairman of the Los Angeles Clippers basketball team. Steve became Microsoft's CEO in 2000, having served for 20 years in roles as president, senior vice president of sales and support, senior vice president of systems software, and vice president of marketing. He was the company's first business manager, and during his tenure at Microsoft, the company pioneered personal computing and democratized enterprise computing, growing from a small startup to a company that, by his retirement in 2014, had grown to almost $80 billion in revenue and was the third most profitable company in the United States. He remains a significant shareholder. Steve and Connie have 3 sons and reside in Bellevue, Washington. This afternoon, Steve joins us for a special discussion with the University of Texas Assistant Dean and my wonderful colleague, Assistant Dean for Civic Engagement and lecturer, Dr. Victoria M. DeFrancesco Soto. Vicki will join Mr. Ballmer in a discussion about USAFacts and the organization's 2021 State of the Union in numbers. Their discussion will be followed by Q&A with students. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ballmer and Dr. Soto.
Thank you, Art, so much for that introduction. And also thank you for connecting Steve Ballmer's team to the University of Texas. Today's event is a joint effort. So I want to thank our partners across the University of Texas campus, IC Squared, the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Engagement, and the College of Liberal Arts Government Department. And all of these are entities that across campus support civic engagement and support civic life. And we have different programs and different areas of expertise, and we do different things. But at the root of it all is the cultivation of engagement, is the cultivation of civic discourse. And civic discourse is rooted upon information, is rooted upon facts. And so this is why I am so excited to have with me Steve Ballmer, who founded USAFacts, because it provides that lifeblood to democracy. Because you cannot have democracy, you cannot have civic engagement without it. So with that, I want to extend a very warm welcome to Steve. Virtually welcome to Austin, and also congratulations on last night's win. So, Steve, let me get started with the basics. Why USAFacts? So you finished up at Microsoft in 2014, and shortly thereafter you launched this initiative. What was the genesis of USAFacts?
Well, as soon as I retired, I was ready to kind of kick back, take it easy. And my wife, who'd been working on our philanthropy for years, said, "No, come on, dude, now's the time for you to engage. You know, you've got to help me on this stuff." And we were talking about, or she was talking about broadening. She'd focused on child welfare issues and broadening out to a more general focus on how philanthropy can help in helping disadvantaged families and children have an opportunity to American dream. And I said, really, at the end of the day, this is all about paying our taxes. If we pay our taxes, we're going to do more, we'll pay our fair share. We'll be happy and proud to write our check. But that's really what it means to help the disadvantaged. She looked at me and said, we can do more than that. We can do better than that. And I said, okay. It turns out she was right. I'll get full circle. It turns out I was right too. But, sometimes when you're in those interactions with people, and I certainly find it true, some with my spouse, I go to this point where I say, I still have to see whether I'm right and prove it. And so I sat down to really try to understand where government revenue comes from and where it gets spent. How much wealth and opportunity is really being transferred from people like me who've been very fortunate to people who've been less fortunate, had less of an opportunity. And it was hard. You would think that was one of the easiest things in the world to find, but you're sitting there in the search engine poking around, and you can find this number that gets spent or that number. The best source I found was actually done by a blogger who happened to live in Seattle, who was British, who had retired, and that was the best thing I could find that was a compendium of facts about the U.S. government. Not facts, a portrait, I would say, of the U.S. government by the numbers. I went looking for anything that's like what's called a 10K report. All public companies have to file them with the Securities and Exchange Commission. They have to be no nonsense, very serious, no forecasts, so that investors can make a proper evaluation of a company without a lot of hyperbole. There was nothing like that on government in the United States. You would think the federal government might have such a thing. It turns out about 3 years later, we did find something sort of kind of like that at the federal government level, sort of. But I decided you really have to look at these things collectively, state, federal, and local government. If you just take Medicaid as an example, it's funded at two levels. You can't look, or roads. If you ask me who built the road outside the hotel where I am right now, I can't tell you whether it's LA County, City of LA, whether there were any federal funds. So how do you paint that picture? And how do you recognize that the goal of government is not to make a profit? You can evaluate what it does and say, are we getting better on health, on education? Do we like what government is doing to promote opportunity and equality? Anyway, long-winded way, Vicki, of saying I couldn't see that. And so I started by building out what we're doing for myself. I'm numbers oriented. We could reduce this to numbers, but as we got into it, we said, this is actually pretty interesting. There's a lot of Americans who can't put together this kind of information. There are a lot of people who weren't applied math majors like I was, who live and breathe numbers. And so we looked at not only put the things together, but in a consumable form.
Well, and Steve, I'm coming at this from a social scientist perspective, right? So I have rolled up my sleeves and gotten into those arcane data sets provided by the government. And it's difficult, it's time consuming. So I think aside from collecting the information and having it in one centralized location, because you have all government data, right? So that is your core source. It's not public opinion data or any think tanks, it's government. But for me, what is so key is the user-friendly nature of it. And I invite the folks on this webinar to check out USAFacts if you haven't already, because it's fun. And I am kind of a nerd, but you can play around with the different graphics, and it has the readily accessible information that otherwise might turn people away and say, that's too complicated to look at. And I think in one of the ways that you're able to transfer that knowledge is, I think a couple of years ago, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, or even more, Steve, you started a State of the Union in numbers. So tell us a little bit about the State of the Union in numbers.
Yeah. Our first products just were more businessy. We did a 10K for government. We still do that. We did an annual report as a business would do. But then we said, what does government do? Well, in our Constitution, it calls for a State of the Union address. Even the founders understood the population needed to be educated. Most States of the Union address have no numbers in them. And yet, if you ask me, numbers about not forecasts of the future, but as you said, numbers that describe what's happened, they are the least partisan thing you can find. Adjectives get partisan. Numbers do not get partisan. The past is what happened. And people shouldn't deliberate. There's the old expression, everybody's entitled to their own opinions, just not everybody's entitled to their own facts. And we decided let's drill in. And so each year at about the time of the State of the Union, we're trying to hit the State of the Union exactly, but when a new president comes in, it's a joint address to Congress, not a State of the Union formally. We thought we were going to get some in February, so we put out our document in February. But it goes through and says, what are the most important things in our estimation to talk about the last year? If you want more information, you can always find it on USAFacts. But we pull that together and try to organize a picture of what has happened in the context of things which may have happened further in the past. So this year, we've taken a look soup to nuts. What has happened with COVID? How has that affected employment? What is the state of education and health in the United States? Immigration. This year, we added a thing that I'm very excited about where we summarize all actions taken at the federal government level. We'll do it eventually at the state level, but it means a summary of legislation, presidential orders, executive orders. We don't have Supreme Court cases in there yet, but you can see how many bills were passed in what areas. And I think it's important for people to know not only what the outcomes are, but what are the knobs and dials, so to speak, or the knobs that government can turn, and how have they turned them?
And it's at these multiple levels, because I know that your organization doesn't just look at the federal level. It also drills down at the state, county, and local level. And I think that the number that sticks out is at 90,000, over 90,000 government entities that y'all collect data for, I think, in one single place. And from the State of the Union, the main piece and what's been on all of our minds as we reach the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic is, what are we seeing in terms of numbers? What are we seeing in this moment in terms of the pandemic, Steve?
Well, caseloads have certainly come down a lot, about a factor of 3 since December, January, when things really exploded. I think off the top of my head, we're down to about 78,000 new cases reported and a few thousand deaths yesterday. The vaccine rate is also exploding. I think we're up to almost 80 million vaccines. And since some people have had 2 and some have had 1, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's roughly 52 million of those are people who've had single doses, and another 25 million roughly have had double doses of the vaccine. Obviously, then the vaccine rate is climbing much faster. We're already, if you think about it this way, about 8 or 9% of the population has had COVID, and about 15 or 16% of the population has now been vaccinated for COVID. We're certainly way past a crossover point, and I think that's a good sign for the country. Certainly, I have a critical birthday myself coming up here soon, and at least as it relates to being vaccinated. And I'm very pleased to see personally, for my family, and just for the sake of our society, what's going on with vaccination.
And it's what's going on with vaccinations, what's going on with cases, what's going on with death at that very granular level, which I think it's important to have one place where you can go and look at that. And for me, in my work, drilling down into Black and Latino populations, the power of seeing the discrepancies by race and ethnicity we know them, and we've heard them in the top lines of the news that Black and brown folks are dying at disproportionate rates. But when I went into the graphs, it's double for pretty much every category except for one. So, I think that is important just to know, to have that informational base, but for us as policymakers or as training future policy leaders to be able to train the lens of what our policy should look like going forward. And, so there's the health impact of COVID. that, it's, the numbers don't lie. It's right there in front of you. But the other major impact that has come from COVID, Steve, is the job loss, is the unemployment that we have been hit with over the course of this year. Talk to us about what has happened in the last 12 months.
Okay, just one follow up on the disaggregation of data that we need in order to look at whether it's ethnicity or race. Our Census Bureau definitions are a little bit different. Latinos is an ethnicity, African American is a race. But looking at that disaggregation in simple ways and complex ways, you have to ask the question, why are those death rates higher? To what degree is it because people are frontline workers? Is it average age? Where are the discrimination vectors? And so you isolate which things you can really control and work on. That I consider key to public policy, is not just looking at the data and saying we got a problem, but where's the action step? That's why I love what we've done with numbers with USAFacts. If you turn to job loss, we've lost about 9.3 million jobs. Unemployment is obviously up. The biggest source of job loss has been in the restaurant business. Yeah. Second is in education. If you add those two together, that accounts for about 2/3 of all the job losses just in those two industries. You can see here, there's been on the slide, there's been a disaggregate, I'm searching for words. You can see the racial and ethnic impacts have been disproportionate for some communities versus others. And that has to do also, you just take a look and say the restaurant industry, you'll see an overrepresentation, if you will, of people of color. And therefore, people of color have also taken a disproportionate hit in many ways on the employment front. If you take a look by industry, this is up as part of the State of the Union on our site, the chart you're looking at. But a way to think about this is, of the people who've lost their jobs, 3% job loss above median income, 8% below median income. This is, and you would think that's true when you think about restaurant workers, but you can actually see by category how big each industry is in terms of, or each occupation is in terms of employment, job loss, and there's a lot of hardship reflected in these numbers. Now, with that said, because of the CARES Act, what we're actually seeing is that aggregate income last year was up over the year before, which when you stop and think about it, it's not what people expect, but there's been so much money transferred through some of the programs that have been put in place. To some degree, what's happened is money's gone out the door and people are saving it, ironically, as opposed to spending it. Now that will look different by income quintile. And unfortunately, again, you'd want good enough data to say, okay, what does the consumption look like for the money that's gone out for the poorest 20% of the people? And how much of that is just benefit that's accruing to the richest 20% of the people? That data doesn't exist. That troubles me as we make new money available. I don't mind making money available. That's not per se my issue, but let's make it available in the right quantities to the right people. And yet the government flies a little blind because our data systems just aren't good enough.
In policymaking requires numbers, requires good numbers. Has there been any engagement with USAFacts and our policymakers, our elected officials at either the state, local, or federal level, Steve?
Yeah, primarily the federal level at this stage, and we've engaged a number of different places. With the General Accountability Office, that's been actually quite a lot of fun. I've gotten to know Gene Dodaro, who runs that, and they do a good job. We're engaged with the federal inspectors general, if you will. They're the integrity arm to make sure government does with the money, not the financial auditors, but if you will, is money getting applied in the way that it was intended? With the coronavirus task force and with the CDC, we had the first county level database in terms of cases by going through and writing software that would scrape PDF files from websites. There's one place, actually, the only virus data existed on an Excel spreadsheet in the county sheriff's office. So we get our people on the phone in that case, calling the county sheriff's office. So we've engaged there. I've had the, I'll say fun. I've had a chance, the speaker, Nancy Pelosi's let me engage with the House Democratic Caucus. Minority Leader McCarthy's allowed me to do that with the Republicans. And one of the most fun things I did, Senator Schumer and Romney, again, bipartisan, because that's where we are, we're nonpartisan. We had a group of about 25, 30 senators sit for almost an hour and just walk through, if you will, a description of our government by the numbers. There is an interest. There really is an interest. It's not everywhere, but there is an interest. And I think what's important for politicians to see is context. Politicians like to grab one number that kind of makes their point. Out of context, I think decision-making should be made with a holistic picture of what's going on.
Yeah, and that's what's so important, is providing the trend lines, providing the information at the multiple levels where you can make that. And I would say not just for government and our elected officials, but also for journalists, for media, for those of us in the classroom to have that. And I want to get to education. Given, we are at a college campus, this is one of the most pressing issues. Again, unemployment has been a biggie as a result of the pandemic, but education, where a big chunk of our kids have been learning via Zoom for the whole year. This weekend will mark the 1 year where most kids have been remote. And so, Steve, what are we seeing the before and after of what education has looked like for our kids, the quality? And then I want to turn to higher education, because there's some pretty powerful information that you all have there.
Yeah, let me remark on two things, both semi-interesting. Number one, our government doesn't have real-time data about how kids are learning, or at least doesn't publish it. If you wanted to go today and crawl a database that shows average academic performance or attendance data and try to assemble that across the country, school district by school district, we don't have the technology yet, although we're working on it. Not every school district publishes it, but it would be good to have as we're engaging in this kind of dialogue. As the federal government in the relief stimulus package that was signed into law or approved yesterday, it would be good to know how much money we need to put into our K through 12 systems. We don't know that. So I can't answer your direct question, how are we doing, Vicki? I'd love to answer that.
Yeah.
The government, it turns out, through its census apparatus, though, also asks questions. It runs its own polls. I believe a Census Bureau poll, I'll believe over any third-party poll. Why? Because the Census Bureau is accountable to the Republicans and the Democrats, the House and the Senate. And in a December poll, half of people with K through 12 students in their households reported that their kids are spending less time learning than before the pandemic. No surprise, but there you can see it. 53% of the population is what our government, I think you got to look at the numbers our government looks at, because those are the things that are going to drive policy making. 28%, about the same amount of time learning and so forth. The other thing that's important, I think, to look at in this context is the notion of the digital divide. Who really does have access even to the technology? If you look at the average population of kids in schools, it is actually getting, if you will, poorer. The average income of kids who are in school, their parents, would be less than it was 20 years ago. The problem of the digital divide, then, you can think of as almost more important in K through 12 households. We don't really have good digital, people will tell you we have good digital divide data. We don't. If you ask, where do we have good internet carriage, you only have to be able to reach one household in a census tract before you can claim that there's internet access in that census tract. And yet you might not be able to get good internet access. And I'm not just talking about rural. People focus in on the rural issues. But you go to part of Los Angeles here, and you will find kids who do not have access to high-speed internet. Last number I remember on that was something like 12 or 13% of families with children didn't have internet access. Well, if you look at that as a percentage of poor kids, it's really quite high.
Yeah, and I remember seeing that on USAFacts where you had that discrepancy between, I think, Black students and their access to internet and non-minority students, which was really impactful. But zooming out a little bit beyond this year, one of the things that was most eye-popping for me, even though I knew it intuitively, was the change in higher ed and how expensive it has gotten and how high our college debt has gotten. I know this is on the mind of my students and the parents who have kids that are coming down the line. So Steve, tell us a little bit about that. Give us a sense of where we are, especially compared to just 2 decades ago.
Yeah, the price of college, and I'm afraid I'll try to remember all these numbers off the top of my head, but the price of college has grown relative even to inflation at quite a high rate. I want to say it's averaging 4% above inflation per year over the last 20 plus years, which is a lot. There's about 1.6 trillion of student debt out there. Now, if you say 1.6 trillion, people can say, oh, that's crazy high. Well, it might be crazy high, but for me, the way to look at it is what is the average, mean, median debt per debt holder for a student who has that debt? It's still high. If I remember off the top of my head, it's $40,000-ish would be the average debt. I think it's 1.6 trillion for, yeah, I may not remember it exactly, but let's say it's $40,000 roughly per debt holder. It's both a lot of money, and if you have to look at it in terms of wages for college graduates versus non-college graduates, you have to decide whether you would make that trade-off. I'm not telling people what they should do. Some people are going to view that as a good trade-off for at least, if not certainty in higher income. If you want a real shot to move up economically, you do need that college degree. People often look at four-year schools and don't factor in community colleges. And yet the number of students, I want to say it's about 2/3 the number of students in community colleges versus four-year schools. And particularly for good paying jobs that require a technical certificate, let me use a high-tech welder. I don't remember, but let's say that's a job that pays $70,000 plus. That's not a job you need a four-year degree for. You can get that kind of training and qualification in community college.
Yeah, I was looking at the number here, Steve. Since the time I went to college, we've seen the cost of tuition go up 80%. I mean that, and I think, like you said, when you are trying to decide what path you want to pursue, you need to look at these numbers and figure out, what is that return on investment going to be based on what I want to do. And I do want to get to a number of student questions.
Vicki, I'm gonna maybe have a little bit of fun. The context on what you said about the increase in tuition since you were in school, a USAFacts follow-up question, which I'm not going to ask you, would be, then how old are you so we can see what the compound, I'm not asking, I'm just saying that would be the USAFacts follow-up question.
Yes, a couple of moons ago, I'll just say that, we'll leave it at that. But case in point, it is all contextual, right? We need the data, we need the numbers. And like I said, we're at the bottom of the hour, and I do want to make sure we get to our student questions because a number of them submitted beforehand. And we have one question here that is very Austin relevant, right? And so this is from Nathan, who asks, who says, this may be difficult to track since many of the people working in arts and entertainment are gig workers, but is there data on how the pandemic has impacted the live events, production, theater industry?
The answer is absolutely yes, you can see this in three ways. And I won't know the numbers off the top of my head, but you can go to our site and you'll actually be able to see by industry job loss. So you can look at what job loss has looked like in the arts and entertainment industry. Government publishes that data. That would be one thing I point Nathan to. Second thing, if you look at the two stimulus bills, there is specific money called out for government institutions like museums, for the arts and humanities, and actually even for private businesses that are in the arts and entertainment business. The third thing I can remark on personally is at the start of the pandemic, my wife and I concluded the purchase of the Forum in LA, which is a music venue. And I could certainly comment on the personally, I have felt, I'm okay with it, but we certainly see the challenges. We made a commitment at the Forum to keep even our first level gig workers fully employed during this period of time, because we've been blessed. But you look at what's happened at arenas, for example, across the country, the arts and entertainment business has been hurt.
And if you remember, and I think, Steve, you were supposed to be here last year at South by Southwest. And, for so many musicians across the country, but especially here in Austin and the venues, this is one of the main sources of income. This is that time of year. And right before that hit, we see the pandemic cause all of the shutdowns. Okay, there are a couple of questions here. I'm going to try to combine a couple. One is from Will, who wants to know, what are three indicators, or for you, Steve, what are three indicators that you look for in terms of success? For example, is low unemployment rate something you would consider a top indicator for success? So here, very much wearing your business MBA hat.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I would certainly look at employment. There's a question of whether you look at unemployment or do you look at employment, i.e. the number of people employed or the number of people who say they want to be employed. Unemployment is down less. Unemployment is less in this recession, pandemic recession, than it was in 2008. Now, why? We've actually had more job loss because we now have fewer people who want to participate in the labor market, particularly women from about 20 to 30 years old. They're not even expressing a desire to work right now, which means they don't look unemployed. But in terms of the number of people who are out there working, feeding families, that number has come down more significantly. So I would look at employment. I would look at total economics that go to the middle class and poorer families. What is total economics? Not just wage income, but you really have to look at taxes and government transfers. What's happened for much of the population is that people's wages and income are down, but they're getting more services from the government, more cash from the government, and they're paying less taxes. That's a phenomenon that's gone on for 20 years. So I'd look at employment. I'd look at wages. I think that's a very important thing. And then I'd probably look at the basket of things which people can afford to purchase or are receiving. One thing, for example, people don't really factor in is healthcare, because many people are on insurance plans where they don't feel the growth in the cost of healthcare. So their healthcare might be better, and yet it's not hitting them quite as hard out of pocket as you might think. A lot of that gets absorbed by government through Medicare and Medicaid. So I'd look at how people live. Means, can I work? What does my total financial situation look like? And what does my lifestyle look like? And government publishes numbers in all those areas, which we have up on our site. So that might be fundamental. Now you could look at criminal justice statistics. You can look at the number of people who have healthcare who don't. But for me, fundamentally, I look at those numbers, and I look at the disaggregation of those numbers by race and ethnicity.
And then following up on that, Steve, Aaliyah asks, how does the data change across quality of life metrics? And I know that the State of the Union and numbers does have a big section on standard of living related, if at all, under Democrat or Republican administrations.
Yeah, we have not, at least I don't know, we have not gone back and done the work to break the data out by administration type. Now, when you say standard of living, you also have to say, what do you mean by that? What does that mean to you, Vicki, to the questioner, to me? Could be very different.
Mm-hmm.
It could be about my income. It could be about my health. It might be about the education of my children and how they're doing. It might be what happens to my incarcerated relative when they leave prison. There's a lot of ways to think about it. And part of what we're trying to do is give you the opportunity to look at the data that answers your question, your view. So I would say three things. Number one, we don't have anything that's specific about D's and R's. Number two, you have to decide, not us, what you think constitutes improvements in life. And one person's improvement is another person's degradation. Some people will say, no, I don't want to pay more taxes in order for us to have better roads. Or for somebody else to have more income, I will have to pay more taxes. That's a personal judgment that people have to make. So that's the second thing I would again highlight for questioner to think about. You know, the pandemic, you can look at some data that gets you to think about it. There was an article in the LA Times. You can look at the data on our site. It's there. Who handled the pandemic better, California or Florida? There's fewer deaths per capita in California. There's more unemployment in California. I'll leave Texas out of it because I haven't looked at the Texas data at all. But you see various different, and you can draw different judgment on who made the best decisions.
So, Steve, I'm going to.
One last thing I want to emphasize is you can ask, do the actions of any administration get reflected during the time that particular governor, president, legislators in office, or these longer term phenomena? If you look at most of the numbers on USAFacts, what you'll see is things have a long, gradual trajectory. Things don't change precipitously, except GDP and employment. And they move with these huge economic reactions. Who or what caused the last recession? We aren't going to try to answer that, but it's not clear who gets the credit, the blame for any of all that. Sorry, back to you.
No worries. These two questions, Steve, there are questions that I also wanted to bring up in our discussion, is how do we convince policymakers to use the same set of facts, and what's been an effective way to deliver this to policymakers? I know you mentioned that you have been engaging with them, but in kind of looking forward, what is the plan, Steve?
Yeah, I think we have a good window on this at the federal government level through this thing called the Data Act. The Data Act is driving not only to produce more data, but to demand data-driven policymaking. Now, it's a bit amorphous, but there's at least a theme to build around in this government legislation, which I think is a great thing. Now, have we made all the progress? No. Are the numbers categorized in the right way? No. Federal government doesn't have authority in all instances over states. We have a thing in this country called states' rights, as everybody on this call would know. But I sure would hope government can play a role in getting data standardized, at least across states, so we can really look at the picture. We've been looking at this George Floyd policing bill, which is in front of the Congress. And one of the fair things you could say is the federal government does not control what police do or how data gets collected, except through its use of the money it gives to local jurisdictions. And yet, if you really want to analyze the problems of policing in this country, there's not enough standardized data collection on who gets stopped, how many stops, look at that by precinct, by police department. That data would be super helpful, for example, in the policing discussion that goes on now.
And on this topic, in the State of the Union in numbers, as well as on USAFacts, I know that you have a number of different sections: criminal justice, policing. One of them that we can just touch on briefly, because one of our questions asks about emissions, is the environment. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about what data, what facts you have on the environment?
Yeah, we have a pretty robust section on energy production, because, if you will, the environment and energy production are not unrelated topics. They just aren't. Emissions data, air quality data. The government provides us a pretty rich data set, much of which we publish on the site today. You could say the good news or the bad news is we are producing less emissions today per person than we did. And at the same time, you could say the bad news is we're still producing more total emissions. We produce about if I remember off the top of my head, about 5 billion tons of carbon every year. China's about double that, but we obviously have a population that's less than a third of China's population. We are seeing a swing away from coal, but it's still about 80% of energy use comes from fossil fuels overall, with probably everybody in Texas understanding there's been a surge in natural gas and oil, even as coal has come down. These are tough challenges. Given that I worked at Microsoft with Bill Gates for whatever that was, 28 years, something like that. I just finished his book, which is an excellent book on climate. And he highlights many of the big challenges. You can get the data. How much of our emissions come from the production of cement or steel? People will focus in on certain things. Cement, for example, the current manufacturing process fundamentally produces CO2. We're trying to build a new arena for the Clippers. And what we're finding is it's hard to get the kind of concrete that does not add to pollution. So there's looking at that data in a disaggregated way and saying, how beneficial would it be for all of us to eat plant-based products as opposed to beef? Or, these are the kinds of questions I think young people particularly have on their mind.
Yeah, so I think in addition to the different areas that we have at USAFacts by issue area, environmental justice, race and ethnicity, one of the biggest questions, and one of our attendees brings this up, and I know Poppy McDonald, the president of USAFacts, has engaged in, about the fact that we're in a crisis of facts. So Tim asks, do you think we'll get back to a place where we can all agree on the facts? I realize statistics can be manipulated, but the past few years have really felt like living on the other side of the looking glass. Do you see us managing to straighten this out?
This is just my opinion. I give you no government facts on this, but my opinion is it probably takes us a while to normalize on this issue. I hope we do. I think it's fundamentally important. I think it's important to tease apart the predictions of the future. You name any economic policy, if somebody says black, somebody else will say white. You can get a D to say one thing, an R to say another. That's about the future. About the past, you can't. And as citizens, I think it's important for us to look at the data about what has happened, as opposed to what our favorite politician tells us what might happen. I think it's important to look at context. Are we going to get there? I think it's going to take a little bit. I think the levels of partisanship remain very high. And I think part of the problem with people turning to facts is it would tend to undermine some level of partisanship. One of the things I think is fascinating is people love to dramatize their difference. I believe in this number being huge, and I believe in this number being small. Well, they might be negotiating a 3% difference, in numbers, but people use adjectives, and adjectives tend to polarize. I don't think we're going to get everybody to be numbers wonks and nerds, as you said, like you and I are, Vicki. I think we can do a little better, but I think it's going to take a few years.
Yeah, because I mean, I think we've fallen into a vicious cycle where those adjectives, they become so charged, and then the emotion takes over and we start moving farther and farther apart. So it is, I agree with you on that, Steve. It is going to take us some time to heal. We're coming toward the close of our talk, and in doing so, Steve, I want to ask you, what's next for USAFacts? You're hitting the 5-year mark. What's in store for the next chapter? And I'm particularly curious in the more direct engagement with different stakeholders, from the elected officials to the nonprofits that serve many of the people who the facts are reported on, to institutions of higher learning or K through 12. What comes next, Steve?
Yeah, I'll put just a list of a few things. Number one, we need more hyperlocal data. People tend to be most interested about what their situation looks like. Can we describe the detail on all of these things in Mississippi or Nebraska or California or Michigan, where I grew up? We need to, and that means crime data, that means economic data. We have the aggregate for the country. And in some of these instances, we can let you look at your state. We want you to not only be able to look at your state, but down to your zip code or your school district, or even your individual school. So that'll be one theme for us. Second theme is to use technology in more and more sophisticated ways. I'll admit, search on our website is not as good as it will be, or I want it to be, or as a former tech industry participant, I think it should be. So adding more technology that helps you not only find the data, but help organize it, show related numbers that you might be interested in. That's very important to us. Number three, I still think we can do fundamentally more to simplify the information through better visualizations. And while I love our site, we're going to continue to think through how to change its organization. What are the products we need to have? And this year, we're taking it on as a clear new goal to engage with government, both to push harder and formally to get more data, and also to educate policymakers on the use of data. We've done some what I'll call interaction, as we discussed earlier, but this is now the time for a concerted campaign. And that includes state and local level. I think people underappreciate how much of government is really done at the state and local level. Government employs, I want to say, about 23 million people. And if I recall off the top of my head, only about 4 million of those are at the federal level. A lot of the work, and if you look at state governments, almost 25% of what they spend may be given to them by the federal government for Medicaid, for childcare, but the states are running a large part of what government does in this country. So those would be the areas of primary investment over the course of the next year or two, Vicki.
Well, as someone who's outside of the Beltway, that focus on state and local level is really important. And it's really important to our policymakers and also to just citizens, to individuals, to understand the workings of their government and how they can get engaged and what they can do to change something that they see that they don't like. In terms of products, I'm corny, but I'll say it. I really enjoyed the Turkey Fest, the Thanksgiving Fest product that you guys put out. I encourage you all to check that out, because not only is it information, a promotion of civic engagement, but it also is family healing for those of us who have Republican and Democratic family members that argue over the facts during Thanksgiving and other family gatherings. I hope USAFacts continues to put out this little snippet of talk about the facts with your family. Maybe a Christmas edition would be a good one as well, Steve. I'm just putting that out there. With that, I want to thank you again for sharing part of your morning with us. We hope to have you back at the University of Texas, hopefully in person. in the not too distant future. And with that, I will sign off. Take care, y'all.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.